When search parties failed to find him after 5 days, he realised he'd die if he didn't find someone to help him. He was now facing a battle far tougher than anything he'd fought in the sky.
Well, I think most airmen were terrified, even more so of the terrain that they came down in than of the enemy up in the air.
But he couldn't stay where he was, so for 3 weeks he paddled from island to island. He was getting weaker all the time, and he constantly risked being spotted and taken prisoner by the Japanese.
Luckily for Bill, he was able to avoid the enemy. But unluckily, he found himself in an area that was sparsely inhabited, so he had to keep island hopping in the hope of finding someone who could help him.
Then, suffering from infected bites and malaria, as well as diarrhea from his coconut diet, he staggered towards a building he'd seen from the raft. He was desperate to find help, even if it was an enemy camp. But all he found was a deserted plantation and some rotten eggs, which he forced himself to eat.
Bill spent 6 days recuperating, rationing the eggs to 2 a day before moving on to the next island. But finding no one there, he returned to the plantation to gather his strength for one last attempt.
By now, Bill knew the US military would have given him up for dead and abandoned their search. He put to sea and paddled for 4 days before passing out in a storm. Amazingly, he drifted into an inhabited island 32 days after ditching. He was so weak that he couldn't stand. His weight had dropped to 7 stone, but he was still alive. By the time he was returned to his unit, he'd been missing for 72 days, and for half that time, he'd survived almost entirely on coconuts. They might not have kept him alive much longer, but knowing how to get into them for food and water had allowed him to live for just long enough.
This is a mature coconut. When they're brown like this, that outer case becomes almost armour-plated and they're very difficult to cut open. Consequently, we have to use a sharpened stick to lever the husk off. So, first thing to know is that a coconut has got 3 corners, 1, 2, 3. And the stick has to go in on one of the corners to achieve leverage. Bear right down on it, a lot of weight. It's hard work. Once you get in there, now we can lever. And we start to open up the husk. This may seem like hard work, but believe me, this is a lot easier than trying to open it with a knife. Beautiful. Right, so what I've got now is the coconut itself and all this fibre, and that's really good. It burns very well, and I can use that with my fire to help me with fire lighting or just to cook on.
You can think of the coconut like a face, with the 2 eyes on the right-hand side and the mouth on the left. That's where you get in for a drink.
Ah, it's delicious. Now, that's much stronger than in the immature coconut, but a refreshing flavouring drink, not something you drink a lot of. Now, to open the coconut, we have to strike it smartly across the top of its skull there.
One of the joys of being in remote places is mastering the skills that the local people use. In fact, it's the key to survival. I even swear that food tastes better here for the effort it takes to cook it. And of course, your life could depend on knowing how to light fires and find things to eat.
I've talked about American servicemen and the problems they had surviving in this environment, but perhaps even more fascinating are the stories of Japanese soldiers who survived on some of these islands long after the war had ended.
One of the most famous was Hiru Onoda. He was found in 1974, 29 years after going into hiding on the island of Lubang, about 200 kilometers from where I am.
As part of his guerrilla warfare training, Onoda was taught to stay alive by any means necessary.
When the Americans overran Lubang in 1945, most of the Japanese soldiers surrendered and 24 died in suicide raids. But Onoda went into hiding, saying later that he wasn't prepared to give himself up until his commanding officer ordered him to do so. The Japanese sent several search parties to look for him, but Onoda even managed to persuade himself that his elderly father's voice was a cunning imitation by Americans out to trick him, and he avoided all attempts at contact.
He lived a nomadic lifestyle, building makeshift huts wherever he felt safest. To keep track of time, he observed the phases of the moon, and amazingly, after 30 years, he was only 6 days out.
For food, Onoda made the most of the fruit and vegetables that grew wild, but he also rigged up ingenious snares. This is a simple noose for catching birds, and it's based on traps that he'd seen the islanders make. And this is a rat trap. The bait inside is connected by woven fibres to a trigger. When the rat takes the bait, it releases the trigger and the door falls down, trapping it inside. Occasionally, Onoda would also raid local farms to steal pigs or cows. For a taste of home, he would rig up a simple steamer using bamboo sticks. Any extra meat he had, he would smoke and preserve for later, working always by night to avoid detection.
In the end, it was a lone Japanese adventurer who found him, but he wouldn't be persuaded the war was over until he was told so by his former commanding officer. So Major Yoshimi Taniguchi was sent to tell him to come out of hiding.
So Hiru Onoda's private war ended after nearly 30 years. But he'd only managed to carry on that long because he knew Lubang better than the locals and could always stay one step ahead of them. On a confined area like a tropical island, you can explore every corner. That gives you a chance to find sources of food and drink and to find out what nasties might be lurking in the bush. These ants could give me a bit of a nip, but there are also cobras and scorpions to avoid. There are edible plants on the island. I've seen the flowers of wild passion fruit and mangoes, but there's only one fruit that's ready to eat at the moment.
This here is the pandanus, and this fruit is just ripening now. The bit you eat is this orange tip here. It's delicious. What we got is lots of fibres covered in a sweet, oily pulp, very palm-like and delicious. The other thing you can do is cut it open, because in each of those segments there's an edible seed. If you're on these islands for any length of time, meat is going to be important in your diet. One animal you might think about catching is the monitor lizard. This is a trap for just such an animal. What I've done basically is constructed a tunnel out of split bamboo. That's the real joy of the tropics. There's never a shortage of material to work with. Now, running vertically into that trap is this stick here, on the end of which is bait. Now, when the animal pulls on that, it dislodges these two loops here, which go in either direction, allowing the doors to shut. Now, when the doors shut, this bar here will drop down in front of it and lodge against these forward uprights so that it's effectively locked shut. Of course, if you catch a lizard, you've got enough food for a week.
These may look like droppings, but they're actually tropical almonds, smaller and sweeter than the ones you get at home, and tricky to get into, even with a machete, but I found loads of them.
Quite delicious. Another thing I came across while I was foraging on the coastline a few minutes ago was that, you might recognize it, cashew nut. You can't eat that as it is, because because it's in a husk which is poisonous. Needs roasting and then shelling.